They say the cockpit is a sanctuary of trust. Two souls 30,000 feet up, holding hundreds of lives in their hands. But what happens when that trust is poisoned by prejudice before the wheels even leave the tarmac? Captain David Okonjo had flown through hurricanes, combat zones, and engine failures without flinching. But on Flight 394 to Chicago, he faced a turbulence no radar could detect, a young, arrogant co-pilot convinced that a man like David didn't belong in the left seat. He thought he could end David's career with one call. He was wrong, dead wrong. The air conditioning inside the cockpit of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 was humming a low, steady vibration that usually calmed Captain David Okonjo. Today, however, the air felt thin, recycled, and laced with an unspoken hostility that made the hair on his arms stand up. Outside the windshield, the tarmac of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport shimmered under the oppressive Georgia heat waves, distorting the view of the baggage carts, scuttling like beetles below. David adjusted his epaulets, the 4 gold stripes glinting under the overhead lights. He had earned every thread of that gold. 25 years of flying, 10 of those in the Air Force flying C-17s into places that didn't officially exist on maps, and 15 more climbing the seniority ladder at Meridian Air. He was 52, his temples dusted with grey, his hands steady and scarred from a life of hard work. He checked the flight management computer FMC, his fingers dancing over the keys with practiced ease. "Pre-flight checklist complete," David murmured, his voice a deep baritone that usually commanded instant respect. Beside him in the right seat sat First Officer Bradley "Brad" Miller. Brad was 26, blonde, with a jawline that looked like it had been chiseled by a marketing team, and a smile that didn't quite reach his icy blue eyes. He was a legacy hire. His father was a retired chief pilot for the airline, and his grandfather had flown in Korea. Brad wore his uniform like a costume he was born into, but today the fit seemed tight. He was tapping his pen rhythmically against his knee, a staccato beat of irritation. "Checklist," Brad repeated, not looking at David. He was staring out the window, watching a Delta jet taxi by. "You missed the hydraulic pressure check on the secondary system." David paused. He hadn't missed it. He had done it while Brad was busy flirting with the lead flight attendant, Sarah, in the galley 5 minutes ago. "I checked it, Brad. Pressures are nominal. System A and B are green." Brad turned his head slowly. The look he gave David wasn't just insubordinate, it was calculating. It was the look of a man who was hunting for a flaw, any flaw, no matter how microscopic. "I didn't see you do it. Standard operating procedure says we verify together. Or do the rules not apply to you, Captain?" The emphasis on "Captain" was slight, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that David knew well. It was the weight of being the only black man in the room for most of his career, the weight of having to be twice as good to get half the credit. David took a slow breath. He rotated his body towards the first officer. "Brad, we are 20 minutes from pushback. I verified the hydraulics while you were getting coffee. If you want to verify them again, be my guest. But drop the attitude. We have a job to do." Brad scoffed a short, sharp sound. "Attitude, I'm just concerned about safety, David. Meridian has high standards. My father always said, complacency kills." "You seem comfortable." "I am experienced," David corrected, his voice hardening. "There is a difference." "Is there?" Brad leaned back, crossing his arms. "I looked up your flight log from last month. You called in sick 3 times. Fatigue, or just couldn't handle the red eyes anymore." "I had family matters to attend to," David said, his patience fraying. His wife Maria had been undergoing chemotherapy. It was private, it was painful, and it was none of this kid's business. Let's focus on the flight plan. We have weather moving in over the Midwest. I want to request a deviation north over Indianapolis to avoid the worst of the squall line. Brad didn't look at the charts David was pointing to. Instead, he reached into his flight bag and pulled out an iPad. He swiped through it aggressively. I was looking at the crew manifest for today. Weird thing. David turned back to the FMC, inputting the waypoint data. What's weird? Your certification date. Brad said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was louder than a shout in the small cockpit. Says you got your ATP rating renewed in Miami last year. Miami. That's a hub for, let's call it, expedited paperwork. David stopped typing. His hand hovered over the exec button. The silence in the cockpit was sudden and absolute. The hum of the avionics seemed to scream. Are you implying something First Officer Miller? David asked, turning to face him fully. Brad shrugged a gesture of mock innocence. I'm just saying I know a guy in Miami. Said for $5,000 you can get a type rating on a 737 Asphalt without ever stepping in a simulator. Just signatures. Lots of diversity hires getting pushed through the system lately to meet quotas. Makes you wonder. Blood roared in David's ears. He had faced racism before. He had faced the subtle exclusion, the jokes that stopped. When he walked into the crew lounge, the passengers who asked the flight attendant if the pilot was in the bathroom when they saw David standing at the cockpit door. But this was a direct assault on his competence, his integrity, and his life's work. I earned my wings at Shepherd Air Force Base, David said, his voice low and dangerous. I flew sorties in the Gulf while you were still learning to tie your shoes. My check ride in Miami was administered by FAA examiner Robert Holloway, one of the toughest in the business. If you have a problem with my credentials, you take it up with the chief pilot after we land. Until then, you do your job. Brad smirked. It was a nasty, triumphant little twist of his lips. He had gotten under the captain's skin. Robert Holloway, the guy who got fired 6 months ago for taking bribes, that Robert Holloway. David blinked. He hadn't heard that. He knew Holloway was tough old school. He hadn't followed the man's career after the check ride. I don't know what you're talking about, David said, turning back to the instruments, trying to regain his composure. He needed to de-escalate. He had a plane to fly. Let's get clearance. I don't think so, Brad said. He wasn't reaching for the radio. He was reaching for his phone. Put that away, David ordered. Sterile cockpit rules apply. We aren't moving yet, Brad shot back. He dialed a number, hitting speakerphone before David could stop him. I'm calling operations. I'm not flying with a pilot whose license might be fraudulent. I have a duty to these passengers. You are insubordinate, David snapped. Hang up that phone. Operations, this is First Officer Bradley Miller on Flight 394. Brad said clearly into the phone, his eyes locked on David's. I have a code red safety concern regarding the captain. I have reason to believe he is operating with invalid credentials obtained through a compromised examiner. I am refusing to fly until this is verified. Over. The voice on the other end was crackly but urgent. Copy that, First Officer Miller. This is Dispatch Manager Gregson. Did you say invalid credentials? Affirmative. Brad said, his voice oozing with self-righteousness. Captain Okonjo's ATP renewal was signed off by Robert Holloway in Miami. I want verification that his license is actually valid before we push back. I'm not risking 180 lives on a diversity quota. David sat there stunned. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. He grabbed his own headset. Gregson, this is Captain Okonjo. This is ridiculous. My license is valid. First Officer Miller is insubordinate and disrupting pre-flight procedures. I am requesting he be removed from this flight immediately. There was a long pause on the line. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Captain Okonjo. Gregson's voice came back colder this time. We take allegations of credential fraud very seriously, especially given the recent FAA audit. We need you to stand down. Do not push back. We are contacting the FAA liaison right now. Stay at the gate. You can't be serious, David said, gripping the yoke. You're listening to a kid with a grudge. We are listening to a safety protocol, Captain, Gregson said. Stay put. Airport police and an FAA inspector are on their way to the aircraft. The line went dead. Brad pocketed his phone, leaning back in his seat with a satisfied sigh. He looked at David, his eyes gleaming. Looks like you're grounded, Captain. Don't worry. I'm sure there's a position open for you driving the baggage cart. It's more your speed. David stared forward, his knuckles white. He felt the heat rising up his neck, the shame, the fury. He looked out the window at the jet bridge. He could see the passengers lining up, oblivious to the fact that the man entrusted with their lives was being treated like a criminal. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't look at Brad. He couldn't. If he did, he might do something that would actually lose him his license. You have no idea what you've just started, Miller, David whispered. I just finished it, Brad replied. I'm cleaning up the cockpit, making it safe again. A heavy knock on the cockpit door startled them both. The door clicked open. It wasn't the flight attendant. It was two officers from the Atlanta Police Department, and behind them, a man in a suit, holding a clipboard. The FAA inspector. Captain David Okonjo, the inspector asked. That's me, David said, standing up. The cockpit felt incredibly small. I'm Inspector Vance. Sorry, Inspector Lawrence. The man corrected himself, glancing at his badge. I need you to grab your flight bag and step off the aircraft. We have a stop order on your certification, pending an immediate investigation. This is a mistake, David said, pleading with his eyes. I have flown for 25 years. Save it for the hearing, the officer said, stepping forward, hand resting near his belt. Let's go, sir. Don't make a scene in front of the passengers. David looked at Brad one last time. Brad offered a small, mocking salute. David grabbed his bag. He walked out of the cockpit, past the confused flight attendants, and into the cabin. The passengers were already boarding. He had to squeeze past a young mother holding a baby, his captain's hat tucked under his arm, his head bowed. He could feel their eyes on him. The whispers started immediately. Is he being arrested? Why is the pilot leaving? Is the plane broken? He looks guilty. David walked up the jet bridge, the heat of the tunnel suffocating him. He had flown thousands of miles, saved lives, mentored dozens of pilots, and it ended like this, escorted off his own plane because a privileged kid decided he didn't belong. As they reached the terminal, the inspector turned to David. Hand over your badge, Captain. You are officially off duty until this is resolved. David unclipped his Meridian Air badge, his identity, his life, and handed it over. His hand trembled slightly. We'll need you to come to the airport authority office, the inspector said. There's someone from Washington on the video link who wants to talk to you. Washington? David asked, confusion cutting through his anger. Yeah, the inspector said, checking his phone. Apparently your first officer didn't just call operations. He flagged your license number in the national database. It triggered a Priority 1 alert. David's stomach dropped. A Priority 1 alert was for terrorists or severe fugitives. What had Brad done? Back in the cockpit, Brad watched David disappear up the jet bridge. He pulled out his phone and texted his father. Mission accomplished. The seat is open. Talk to the scheduling board. I'm ready for my upgrade. He chuckled, spinning the captain's hat, that David had left on the console on his finger. "Goodbye, David. Hello, Captain Miller." But Brad didn't notice the flashing red light on the overhead panel. The aircraft communications, addressing and reporting system AERS was printing a message. It wasn't from Meridian Operations. It was from the Department of Defense. The room was sterile. White walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a large monitor mounted on the wall. David sat alone, his hands clasped on the table. The humiliation of the walk through the terminal was burning in his chest. He had seen colleagues, pilots he had flown with, flight attendants he had shared Christmas dinners with, watching him being escorted by police. They had looked away. That hurt more than the stares of the strangers. The door opened, and Inspector Lawrence walked in. He looked less confident now. He was sweating. "Captain," Lawrence said, his voice tight. There's been a development." "Can I call my union rep?" David asked tiredly. "I have rights." "You won't need a union rep," Lawrence said, sitting down and placing a thick file on the table. "This isn't a union matter anymore. It's a federal one." The screen on the wall flickered to life. The resolution was crisp. A man sat behind a mahogany desk, the seal of the Federal Aviation Administration behind him. But it wasn't just any FAA bureaucrat. David recognized him. It was Director Samuel Hollenbeck, the head of flight standards for the entire eastern region. And sitting next to him was a man in a military uniform, a general with 3 stars on his shoulder. General Arthur Bull Mitchell. David's breath hitched. He hadn't seen Mitchell in 15 years. Not since Operation Desert Ghost. "David," General Mitchell said, his voice booming through the speakers. "You look like hell, son." "General," David said, straightening his spine instinctively. "Director Hollenbeck." "Captain Okonjo," Hollenbeck said, adjusting his glasses. "We received a flag on your license number, user ID 894 Alpha Zulu. The flag originated from the cockpit of Flight 394. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," David said. "My first officer, Bradley Miller, accused me of fraud. He claimed my ATP renewal in Miami was illegitimate because the examiner Robert Halloway was under investigation." General Mitchell laughed. It was a dry, barking sound. Halloway is a patsy. He takes bribes for Cessna ratings for dentists. He didn't sign your renewal, David." David frowned. "So my logbook says Halloway." "Your logbook says Halloway because your real renewal is classified," Mitchell said, leaning forward. "Or did you forget the work you did for us last October?" David's mind raced back. Last October. He had requested a week of personal leave. He told Maria he was going fishing. In reality, he had been summoned to Groom Lake. The Air Force needed a pilot with specific heavy lift experience to test a new prototype transport craft, something that handled like a brick and flew at Mach 085. It was dangerous, off-the-books flying. "I remember, sir," David said softly. "But I thought the paperwork was handled through civilian channels to keep my cover." "It was," Hollenbeck interjected. "We used Halloway's stamp as a placeholder in the civilian database, so your commercial license wouldn't show a gap. It's a standard ghost protocol for reserve pilots assisting in classified testing. But when your first officer ran the specific serial number of that stamp through the public FAA registry, he didn't just find a discrepancy. He tripped a silent alarm we put on that file to alert us if anyone started digging into the classified program." David sat back, the realization washing over him. Brad hadn't just reported him to the airline. Brad had inadvertently tried to expose a black project. "So," David said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "First Officer Miller just hacked a classified military database." "In a manner of speaking," General Mitchell grinned. "He used an unauthorized third-party app to cross-reference your license. We traced the ping, The idiot is using a paid search service that buys data from the dark web. That's a felony, by the way. Violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and doing it from the cockpit of a commercial airliner. That's federal terrorism charges if we want to push it. Inspector Lawrence looked pale. So, Captain Okonjo is legal. Legal. General Mitchell snorted. Inspector Captain Okonjo is one of 5 pilots in this country certified to fly the X-99. His license is backed by the President of the United States. If he wants to fly a kite, he needs Secret Service clearance. He is the most qualified pilot on that tarmac. Hollenbeck looked at David. We apologize for the inconvenience, Captain. But this situation, it actually presents us with an opportunity. Opportunity? David asked. We've been investigating a ring of pilots buying their way into cockpits, Hollenbeck said. Rich kids' legacy hires using apps and connections to bypass simulator hours. We think your first officer, Mr. Miller, might be projecting. He accused you of fraud. Usually the guy shouting thief. The loudest is the one with the stolen goods in his pocket. David thought about Brad's lack of knowledge on the hydraulic check, the way he fumbled with the FMC, the arrogance covering up incompetence. You want me to go back? David asked. We want you to go back, General Mitchell said, but not just to fly. We want you to turn the screws. We're going to authorize you to perform a line check on First Officer Miller. Right now, in real time. A line check, David asked. He'll refuse. He won't, Hollenbeck said. Because I'm sending a digital order to his iPad right now. It will look like a random audit from the FAA. It will say that due to the security concern he raised, the FAA is mandating a full competency review of both pilots before the flight can be cleared. If he refuses, he loses his license on the spot. David stood up. He picked up his hat. The shame was gone. In its place was a cold steel resolve. General, David said, does this mean I can fail him? David, the general said softly. I want you to bury him. The mood in the cabin of Flight 394 was restless. 45 minutes had passed since the captain had been escorted off. The air conditioning was struggling against the Georgia heat, and the passengers were fanning themselves with safety cards. In the cockpit, Brad Miller was feeling good. He had his feet up on the rudder pedals, a major violation of protocol while at the gate, but who was watching? He was texting his girlfriend, bragging about how he had cleaned house, and how he was practically the acting captain now. Just waiting for them to send a reserve pilot, he typed. Probably some old guy I can boss around. This is my ship now. Suddenly, the movement in the jet bridge caught his eye. He sat up expecting to see a reserve captain, maybe a guy named Smith or Jones. Instead, he saw David Okonjo. David walked differently this time. Before he had walked with the quiet confidence of a professional. Now he walked with the heavy, terrifying momentum of a freight train. He was flanked not by police, but by Inspector Lawrence, who was now carrying David's flight bag like a deferential squire. David stepped onto the plane. The lead flight attendant, Sarah, gasped. Captain, I thought... Glitch in the system, Sarah. David said, his voice projecting clearly, so the passengers in the first few rows could hear. Turns out my credentials are a bit too high level for the standard database to read. Apologies for the delay. Let's get this bird in the air. A ripple of relief went through the cabin. A few passengers even clapped. David ignored it. He had a target. He opened the cockpit door. Brad's jaw literally dropped. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a magic trick. You, Brad stammered. You were arrested. I saw them take your badge. David didn't say a word. He stepped in, hung his jacket on the hook, and sat down in the left seat. He adjusted his seat height, slowly, deliberately. Then he turned to Inspector Lawrence, who was standing in the doorway. Inspector, David said, Please inform the first officer of the current status of this flight." Inspector Lawrence cleared his throat. He handed Brad a piece of paper with the FAA seal on it. "First Officer Miller, in light of the severe safety allegations raised by yourself, the FAA has authorized an immediate on-the-spot line competency check for this crew. Captain Okonjo has been cleared by Washington. However, Washington is now concerned about the judgment of the reporting officer." Brad stared at the paper. "What me, why me?" "Standard procedure." David cut in his voice, smooth as silk. "You claimed there was a safety risk in this cockpit. The FAA agrees. They just aren't sure which seat the risk is sitting in. So for this flight, I am not just your captain. I am a designated check airman." David pointed to the jump seat behind them, the small fold-down seat usually reserved for observers. Inspector Lawrence squeezed into the cockpit and sat down in it, buckling himself in. "I will be observing," Lawrence said. "Captain Okonjo will be administering the oral and practical exam during the flight. Any failure to perform to ATP standards will result in immediate revocation of your license upon landing in Chicago." Brad's hands started to shake. "You can't do this. This is retaliation." "It's not retaliation, Brad," David said, flipping switches on the overhead panel with lightning speed. "It's verification. You like verification, right? You love checking credentials. So let's check yours." David turned to him. The warmth was gone from his eyes. They were hard, dark flint. "Let's start with the pre-flight you claimed you did so perfectly. Walk me through the memory items for a rejected takeoff below 80 knots. Go." Brad froze. His mind, usually so quick with a retort, went blank. Throttle to idle." "Incorrect phrasing," David snapped. "Standard call-out is reject. Then thrust levers to idle. Verify speed brake deployment. Why are you stuttering? You said you were concerned about safety. Do you not know the emergency procedures for the aircraft you are sitting in?" "I know them," Brad yelled, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's just, you're pressuring me." "The engine failing at V1 is pressure," David said calmly. "I'm just a guy asking a question. Now let's rerun the before-start checklist. And Brad, don't skip the hydraulics this time." Brad fumbled for the checklist. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped it. It slid under the rudder pedals. He had to unbuckle and scramble down to get at his face, burning with humiliation. Inspector Lawrence scribbled something on his clipboard. The scratching sound was deafening. "Got it," Brad panted, climbing back into his seat. "Operations, this is Meridian 394, David said into the radio. "We are ready for pushback. Clearance received." As the tug began to push the plane back, David turned to Brad. "You're flying the leg, Brad?" Brad looked at him, terrified. "I am. You wanted to be in charge," David said. "So fly the plane, but I'm warning you. If you deviate more than 50 feet from assigned altitude or 5 knots from target speed, I'm taking the controls. And if I take the controls, you fail. If you fail, you're done. Do you understand?" "Yes, Captain," Brad whispered. "Louder," David commanded. "Confirm you understand the parameters of this test." "I understand," Brad said, his voice cracking. "Good," David said. "Flaps 5. Let's go." The taxi to the runway was excruciating for Brad. Every turn, every brake application was scrutinized. David sat like a statue, watching the instruments with hawk-like intensity. "You're taxiing at 22 knots, David observed casually. "Company limit is 20 straight line. That's a strike." The speedometer is lagging," Brad lied. "The ground speed indicator is GPS-driven," David said. "It doesn't lag. That's 2 strikes. 1 for speeding, 1 for lying to a check airman." Brad gulped. He was failing before they even took off. They reached the holding point for runway 27R. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Brad lined the plane up. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Take off power!" Brad called out, pushing the throttles forward. The engines roared. The plane surged forward. "V1!" David called out. "Rotate!" Brad pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. They were airborne. For a second, Brad relaxed. He was in the air. He could do this. He just had to fly straight and level to Chicago. But David wasn't done. He reached for the radio. "Departure Meridian 394 with you passing 2,000 for 10,000, David said. Then he switched the intercom to the cabin, but kept his finger hovering over a specific button on the flight computer. "Brad's how?" David said off-air. "What is the immediate action for a runaway stabilizer trim? Cut out switches to cut out," Brad recited automatically. "Good," David said. "Now what do you do if your primary flight display goes dark?" "Switch to standby instruments," Brad said. "Demonstrate it," David said. "What layer?" "We are in VMC visual meteorological conditions," David said, gesturing to the clear sky above the clouds. "I am failing your primary flight display. Now." David reached over and dimmed Brad's main screen until it was black. "Hey!" Brad shouted. "You can't do that. System failure simulation," David said coldly. "You have no attitude indicator, no speed tape on your main screen. Fly the plane using the backups. Maintain heading 270. Climb to flight level 240. Don't bust your altitude." Brad stared at the tiny standby dial in the center of the panel. It was the size of a coaster. He had to squint to see it. He gripped the yoke tighter, his knuckles white. The plane banked slightly to the left. "Watch your bank," David warned. "You're drifting." "I can't see the horizon properly," Brad complained. "A pilot doesn't need a TV screen to fly," David said. "A pilot feels the aircraft. You told me my license was fake. You told me I was a diversity hire. Show me what a real pilot can do, Brad." Brad was sweating profusely now. The sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging them. He wiped his face with his shoulder, fighting the controls. The plane porpoised slightly. Up, down, up, down. "Passengers are going to get sick," Inspector Lawrence noted from the back, his pen scratching loudly again. "Vertical speed is erratic." "Steady it out," David barked. "I'm trying," Brad yelled. "Don't try," David said. "Do, or I take the controls." Just then, the radio crackled. "Meridian 394 traffic at 12 o'clock, 5 miles opposite direction, 1,000 feet above. Monitor." "Traffic in sight," David said. He looked at Brad. "Do you see the traffic?" Brad scanned the sky frantically. He couldn't focus. He was too busy staring at the tiny backup dial. I don't see it. It's a heavy," David said. "Boeing 777, hard to miss. If you can't maintain situational awareness while flying on instruments, you aren't safe." I see it, Brad lied again. "Where?" David asked. Left side." David pointed out the right window. A massive Singapore Airlines jet was passing them on the right miles away, but clearly visible. "That's 3 strikes, Brad," David said quietly. Brad's shoulders slumped. "Please, David. Captain, don't fail me. My dad will kill me." David looked at him. For a split second, he felt pity. Just a scared kid trying to fill shoes that were too big for him. But then he remembered the diversity hire comment. He remembered the smug look when the police arrived. He remembered the passengers staring at him like he was a criminal. "Your dad isn't in this cockpit," David said, "and neither is your ego anymore. We have weather ahead. Indianapolis Center is reporting severe turbulence at flight level 300. I was going to go around it. But since you need to prove your skills, we're going through it." Brad's eyes went wide. through the squall line. You said you wanted to verify the hydraulics, David said, tightening his own harness. Let's see how they hold up under stress. The sky ahead turned a bruised purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. The radar on David's side, which he had kept fully functional, showed a nasty cell of red and magenta directly in their path. Request deviation, Brad pleaded. We can go right 20 degrees. Unable, David lied. ATC says airspace is saturated. We have to thread the needle, maintain velocity 280 knots. Do not let the airspeed bleed off or we stall. The first bump hit them like a giant hammer, striking the fuselage. The coffee cup in the holder rattled violently. Airspeed, David shouted. Brad was fighting the yoke. The plane dropped 200 feet in a second, then shot back up. The autopilot disconnected with a loud cavalry charge alarm. I have control, Brad shouted, his voice high-pitched. You have control, David acknowledged. Keep the nose down. You're climbing into a stall. The stick shaker activated the yoke, vibrating violently in Brad's hands to warn of an impending stall. Push it down, Inspector Lawrence yelled from the jump seat. Brad was frozen. Panic, the pilot's true enemy, had seized his brainstem. He was pulling back, trying to climb away from the ground, a rookie mistake in a high-altitude stall. David saw it. He saw the terror in Brad's eyes. The kid wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerous. My aircraft, David roared. He grabbed his yoke. He didn't fight Brad. He overpowered him. He pushed the nose down, aggressively breaking the stall. The G-forces lifted them out of their seats against the belts. The engines whined as David smoothed the throttles. I have control, David repeated calmly. First Officer Miller, remove your hands from the controls. Place them on your lap. Now. Brad let go, as if the yoke were red hot. He slumped back, hyperventilating. David flew the plane with one hand, his other hand adjusting the trim. He guided the 737 through the turbulence with the grace of a surgeon. He anticipated the drops countering them before the passengers could feel the full brunt. Within 2 minutes they were out of the worst of it, breaking into a patch of smoother air. David leveled the plane off. He engaged the autopilot. The silence returned to the cockpit, broken only by Brad's ragged breathing. David turned to Inspector Lawrence. Inspector note. Time 14. A 35 Zulu. First Officer Miller lost control of the aircraft in moderate turbulence. Resulted in stick shaker activation. Check airman assumed control to prevent aerodynamic stall. Lawrence wrote it down. Noted. That's a critical failure, Captain. David turned to Brad. The young man was staring at his lap tears, streaming down his face. He was broken. You almost killed us. David said, his voice devoid of anger now. It was just cold, hard fact. You were so busy checking my background you forgot to learn how to fly. You assumed that because of who I am, I couldn't do the job. And because of who you are, you automatically could. Brad didn't speak. He just shook his head. You're relieved of duty, Miller, David said. I'll fly the rest of the leg solo. You will sit on your hands and not touch a single switch until we are at the gate in Chicago. If you do, I will have you arrested for interference with a flight crew. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Brad whispered. Sir, David repeated, savoring the word. That's better. The rest of the flight was silent. David handled the descent into O'Hare, beautifully greasing the landing despite a 15-knot crosswind. As they taxied to the gate, Brad looked like a ghost. But the real karma wasn't done yet. As they pulled into the gate, David saw the jet bridge connecting. Inspector, David said. Do we have a welcoming committee? Lawrence looked out the window. Looks like it. 2 FAA enforcement agents and... Is that a news crew? David smiled. I think word might have gotten out about the fake license. Scare, The media loves a scandal. "They're here for you," Brad said, finally finding his voice. "They're going to roast you for the turbulence." David unbuckled. "I don't think so, Brad. I think they're here because Director Hollenbeck released a press statement while we were in the air." "What statement?" Brad asked. David picked up his phone and showed the screen to Brad. It was a breaking news alert. Headline: FAA sting operation exposes pay to fly. Pilot fraud ring. Subtitle: Hero. Captain David Okonjo lands safely after exposing unqualified co-pilot mid-flight. Brad read the headline. His face went grey. "You set me up?" Brad whispered. "No," David said, standing up and putting on his hat. "You set yourself up. I just turned on the lights." He opened the cockpit door. The passengers were disembarking, but many stopped to thank him. "Great flying, Captain. That was rough, but you handled it." David nodded to them. Then 2 federal agents in windbreakers stepped onto the plane. "Bradley Miller?" one of them asked. Brad stood up, his legs wobbling. "Yes." "We have a warrant for your arrest," the agent said. "Charges include wire fraud, accessing a protected federal database, and endangering the safety of a commercial flight." They handcuffed him right there in the cockpit doorway. Brad looked at David, pleading one last time. "David, tell them it was a misunderstanding." David looked at the handcuffs. He looked at the wings pinned to Brad's chest. "Inspector Lawrence," David said, "can you retrieve Mr. Miller's wings? He won't be needing them where he's going." The walk through O'Hare Terminal 3 felt like a victory lap, though David didn't treat it as one. He walked with his head high, ignoring the flashing cameras of the local news crews who had gathered at the gate. They shouted questions. "Captain Okonjo, is it true your co-pilot was arrested?" Captain, was the flight in danger? But David simply offered a polite nod and kept moving toward the crew lounge. Behind him, however, the scene was far less dignified. Brad Miller was being escorted by federal agents, his wrists cuffed behind his back, his uniform jacket draped over his hands in a futile attempt to hide the steel bracelets. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at the floor, his face a mask of shock. The golden boy of Meridian Air, the son of the legendary chief pilot, was being paraded like a common criminal. In the crew lounge, the atmosphere was electric. Pilots and flight attendants huddled around the TV screens watching the live feed from the gate. When David walked in, the room went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into spontaneous applause. It wasn't loud, raucous cheering. It was the respectful, rhythmic clapping of professionals acknowledging a master. David poured himself a coffee, his hand finally shaking just a little as the adrenaline faded. "Hell of a day, David," said Captain Reynolds, a senior pilot who had flown with Brad's father back in the day. Reynolds looked grim. "You know who's coming, right?" "I expect I do," David said, taking a sip. "Miller Sr. doesn't let his boy go down without a fight." "He's in the chief pilot's office right now," Reynolds warned, "screaming so loud you can hear it through the drywall. He's threatening to sue the FAA, the airline, and you personally." David set his cup down. "Let him scream." The door to the lounge banged open. Standing there was Captain Richard Miller, Rhett, a man who looked like an older, angrier version of Brad. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than David's car, and his face was a mottled red. "Okonjo," Miller barked, scanning the room until his eyes locked on David. "You son of a bitch! You set him up!" The room went deadly quiet. David turned slowly. "Mr. Miller, I'd suggest you lower your voice. This is a professional environment." "Professional?" Miller stormed across the room, stopping inches from David's face. "You humiliated my son on national television. You baited him. You knew he was stressed about the upgrade, and you pushed him until he cracked. I didn't push him, Richard, David said, calmly. I asked him to fly the airplane. He couldn't. He's a damn good pilot, Miller shouted. He has the best training money can buy. That's exactly the problem, David said, his voice hardening. You bought his training. You bought his hours. You probably bought his check rides, too. But you couldn't buy him the instincts to handle a stall at 30,000 feet. Today, money didn't matter. Physics did. Miller sneered. You think you're untouchable because the feds used you for some secret op? Don't make me laugh. You're a token, David. You always have been. The only reason you're in that left seat is because the airline needed a poster boy for diversity. The insult hung in the air ugly and archaic. A few younger pilots gasped. David didn't flinch. He took a step forward, forcing Miller to take a step back. Let me tell you something about tokens. Richard, David said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. A token is something you use to pay a toll. It has no value of its own. I have 15,000 hours of command time. I have landed safely with an engine fire in Kandahar. I have flown supplies into hurricanes when guys like you were grounded. David poked a finger into Miller's expensive suit right on the lapel. Your son? He's the token. He's a token of your ego. You put him in a seat he didn't earn because you wanted a mini-me. And today that token got spent. Miller knocked David's hand away. I will bury you. I have friends on the board. I'll have your license pulled for creating a hostile work environment. You'll be flying cargo in Alaska by next week. I don't think so, a new voice said. Everyone turned. Director Hollenbeck from the FAA was standing in the doorway, still flanked by General Mitchell. They had evidently flown in immediately following the incident, or perhaps they had been in Chicago all along, waiting for the trap to spring. Director Hollenbeck, Miller stammered. The color drained from his face. He knew Hollenbeck. They played golf at the same club. Richard, Hollenbeck said coldly, we need to talk. Not about Captain Okonjo, about your consulting firm. My... What? Miller Aviation Consultants. Hollenbeck said, stepping into the room. We just raided your offices in Miami. It seems your firm specializes in expedited processing for pilot certifications. We found the ledger, Richard. We know you paid Robert Halloway to sign off on your son's hours. Brad didn't just fail a check ride today. He was flying with a fraudulent license that you bought for him. The room gasped. This was the nuclear bomb. Miller staggered back, hitting a table. That's a lie. It's a witch hunt. We have the wire transfers, General Mitchell added, crossing his arms. And since some of those falsified licenses were used to gain access to secure military charter flights. Well, Richard, you're not just looking at FAA fines. You're looking at treason charges. Miller looked at David, then at Hollenbeck, then at the floor. The arrogance evaporated, leaving only a terrified old man. I did it for him, Miller whispered. He wasn't a natural. He struggled. I just wanted to give him a leg up. You gave him a loaded gun and pointed it at 180 passengers, David said. You didn't help him. You ruined him. Hollenbeck motioned to the door. 2 more agents appeared. Richard Miller, you're coming with us. As they led the sputtering patriarch away, the silence in the lounge held for a moment longer. Then Captain Reynolds walked up to David and extended his hand. I think I speak for everyone here, David, Reynolds said. Thank you. For keeping the standard. David shook the hand. Just doing the job, Jim. Just doing the job. The aftermath fortort. Hours later, the story was everywhere. The New York Times, CNN, Fox News. The headline had shifted from "Pilot Arrested" to The Ghost Pilot, How a Hero Captain Exposed an Industry-Wide Scandal. Meridian Air's stock took a hit initially, but then bounced back when the CEO announced a complete overhaul of their hiring practices and named Captain David Okonjo as the new head of pilot standards and training. David was sitting on his porch back in Atlanta, watching the sun set. His wife, Maria, sat beside him. She looked better today. The chemo was working. Her hair was starting to grow back a soft fuzz that David loved to touch. "You're famous," Maria teased, scrolling through her phone. "Someone on Twitter made a fan cam of you walking through the terminal. It has 2 million views." David groaned. "Please don't show me." "They're calling you Captain Karma," she laughed. "I prefer Captain Okonjo," he said, taking her hand. His phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. Area code 202, Washington, D.C. "Hello," David answered. "Captain Okonjo," a woman's voice. "Please hold for the Secretary of Transportation." David sat up straighter. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Captain Okonjo." The secretary's voice came on the line. "I'm calling to personally thank you for your actions on Flight 394. You saved lives, and you helped us cut out a cancer in the aviation industry. Thank you, Madam Secretary," David said. "However," she continued, "there is one loose end. Brad Miller." "Is he in custody?" David asked. "He is. He's facing 5 to 10 years. But he's asking to see you." "Me?" David frowned. "Why?" "He says he won't talk to the prosecutors until he speaks to you. He says he owes you an apology, and he has information about other pilots, but he'll only give it to Captain Okonjo." David looked at Maria. She squeezed his hand and nodded. She knew him. She knew he wouldn't turn away from a chance to fix things, even with the man who tried to destroy him. "When can I see him?" David asked. "Tomorrow morning," the secretary said. "We're flying you up. But David, be careful. The kid is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." The Federal Detention Center in Chicago was a grim block of concrete, a far cry from the luxury Brad Miller was used to. David sat on one side of the glass partition. Brad sat on the other, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely. He looked 10 years older than he had just days ago, eyes hollow, hands shaking. "You came," Brad said, his voice cracking through the intercom. "I wanted to know. When the stick shaker went off, you hesitated before taking control. Why?" "I wanted to give you a chance," David said. "I wanted to believe there was a pilot in there." Brad looked down, a tear splashing onto the counter. "There isn't. My dad told me the rules were for other people. I never learned to fly, David. I just learned to act like a pilot. And now the act is over." "Yeah." Brad leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, the feds want names. They want the whole network. So give them the names." "I can't," Brad hissed, glancing nervously at the guards. "Not without protection. It wasn't just my dad. He was the middleman, the guy printing the fake certificates. He's Cartel David, Sinaloa. They use the fake pilots to move product on private jets." A chill ran down David's spine. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized crime. "Why tell me?" David asked. "Because they're going to kill me," Brad whispered, terror in his eyes. "If I talk, I'm dead. The general listens to you. Tell them I need witness protection. If you get me, that I'll give you the kingpin." David looked at the young man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the desperation of a frightened child caught in a web far too big for him. "I'll make the call," David said, standing up. "But if you lie to me again, I won't be coming back." David walked out into the sunlight and immediately dialed General Mitchell. "General, we have a problem," David said, scanning the parking lot. "It's Cartel Big. Brad is ready to sing, but we need to move him. Now, he says he's a target." "Understood," Mitchell replied. "Sending a team." David hung up. Across the street, a black SUV with tinted windows was idling. As David watched the window roll down just an inch, his combat instinct screamed, "Duck!" David threw himself behind a concrete pillar just as the black SUV's window rolled down. Pop, pop, pop. 3 shots chipped the concrete inches from his head. The suppressed thwip signaled professionals. "Gunshots, officer, down!" A voice screamed from the entrance. The SUV screeched away into Chicago traffic. David's phone rang. It was General Mitchell. "David, hit order confirmed. Are you safe?" "They missed," David said, adrenaline surging. "But if they missed me, they're going for Brad. Get him out, now." "Extraction team is 10 minutes out," Mitchell cursed. "Too long." David moved toward the panicked guards at the entrance. "I'm going back in." "David, don't be a hero. That kid is my responsibility, General." David flashed his military ID to the warden. "Lockdown. You have compromised guards inside." Ignoring the confusion, David sprinted for the visitation block. He reached the hallway just as chaos erupted. One of Brad's escort guards had drawn his weapon, pointing it directly at the cell door. "Open it!" The corrupt guard shouted at the control officer. "Open it or I drop you!" Inside the cell, Brad huddled in the corner, screaming. "Hey!" David's voice boomed. The gunman spun. David tackled him, slamming him into the wall. The gun skittered away. The younger guard threw a heavy punch, catching David's jaw and sending him reeling. As the guard scrambled for his weapon, David ripped a fire extinguisher off the wall and swung. Clang! The guard crumbled. David kicked the gun away, gasping blood dripping from his lip. "You!" Brad stammered from the cell. "You came back." "I told you." David winced. "I had to make a call." Boots thundered down the hall. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." General Mitchell arrived with the tactical team helping David up. "You cut it close, Captain." "Just holding the pattern, General." 6 months later, the Senate subcommittee hearing room was packed. Brad Miller, sober and wearing prison blues, sat before the microphone. "My name is Bradley Miller. For 3 years, I flew with a license I didn't earn. My father paid for it. But the supplier was Hector Vance, a coordinator for the Sinaloa cartel." Cameras flashed blindingly. Brad looked up at the gallery, locking eyes with David. "I am testifying because one man refused to let me slide. Captain David Okonjo saved my life twice. He taught me that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about owning your failures." The gavel banged. The dismantling of the Ghost license ring grounded over 200 pilots and shattered a major cartel supply chain. The final flight, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. 1 year later, Captain David Okonjo walked onto the jet bridge of a new Boeing 787. His badge now read, Director of Flight Operations. In the right seat sat First Officer Sarah Jenkins, young, black, and visibly nervous. She was furiously checking the hydraulic systems. "Good morning, Captain," she trembled. "Pre-flight complete. Hydraulics green." David smiled warmly, seeing himself in her. "Relax, Sarah. Just fly the plane." "Yes, sir." She smiled, the tension melting. "And Sarah, if you see me miss a check, you call it out. Loud and clear." "You got it, Captain." Meridian 88 cleared for takeoff. The tower chirped. David pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, a sound of power and truth. As the plane lifted into the blue banking toward the sun, David finally felt the weight lift. The turbulence was behind him. The pilot in the left seat was exactly where he belonged. Captain David Okonjo didn't just fly a plane. He navigated a storm of corruption to land on the side of truth. His story reminds us that competence has no color, and integrity is the only currency that matters at 30,000 feet. Brad Miller learned you can buy a title, but you can't buy respect. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Do you think the punishment for the fake pilots was enough? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a flight with us. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.